Hi, my name is Alex Nykirk, and my presentation is on the Great Depression. The Great Depression was a catastrophic global event that saw millions of people slide into poverty. Across America, men and women both would stand in breadlines for any source of food and live in shanty towns. In Germany, the devastation caused by the Great Depression ultimately gave rise to the Third Reich and then soon led to the start of World War II. People still celebrate the 1920s as a golden era of parties and glamour, but the seeds of the Great Depression were planted in these years of complacency. Although the stock market crash of 1929 is often used as a start date for the Great Depression in the US, it is not the only cause of the disaster. In Europe, in the early 20s, the economy was already in pieces. Most of Europe struggled to repay debts owed to America from World War I. Germany, in particular, was paying very, very heavy reparations. In 1922, Germany was experiencing something known as hyperinflation. As their money became increasingly worthless, workers collected wages in wheelbarrows, and desperate people even burned cash to stay warm. At its lowest point in 1923, 1 trillion German marks were worth $1. Germany's shaky economy was briefly resurrected by a currency reform and the Dawes Plan, which relaxed some reparations Germany had to pay. Nonetheless, it was not enough to prevent the rise of the far right during the 1920s. In the US, on the other hand, the economy was completely booming. Taxes were repeatedly cut to encourage spending, wages rose, and consumerism flourished. The rise of the automobile industry was a massive stimulus for the American economy. This industry not only provided factory jobs, but it also provided jobs for building roads and petrol stations. America's landscape was forever changed by the car, and many people could now travel further to find work. Many older industries also benefited from car manufacturing, as many factory bosses copied Henry Ford's brilliant assembly line model to mass-produce goods. For the wealthiest in society, new inventions like radios and washing machines became popular consumer items. Some people bought new gadgets on credit, a mistake which would come back to haunt them later. This decade was exceptional for New York, where Wall Street was a hive of activity. The Empire State Building and Rockefeller Center were built in this period. Along with these, a forest of new skyscrapers transformed the landscape. New York's prosperity was funded by the new trend of buying stocks and shares. Many ordinary people, as well as professional speculators, played the stock market for the first time. With share prices climbing fast, people were convinced that the stock market was a great way to make money quickly. Some people even took out loans to buy stocks. And although share prices rose exponentially throughout the decade, the economy was already slowing down in real terms from the mid-20s onwards. Global trade had stalled, and few major powers could afford to spend on luxury items. The European market had shrunk considerably due to the austerity caused by World War I. And although the US had done much better due to the war, they would quickly reach a saturation point for the sale of new goods without a thriving global market to sell to. And farming in the US had also slowed down. Agriculture had expanded massively during the First World War, but demand fell dramatically after the war ended. The industrialization of farms had put many farmers into debt and many farm hands out of work as well. While crop yields were at an all-time high, the market was completely saturated at home and there was very little opportunity for expansion abroad. With almost 1/3 of Americans still working in agriculture in this era, the industry's collapse would have many consequences. Many farmers were already struggling to pay their bills in the middle of the 1920s. Knowledge of this challenging reality inevitably hit home in Wall Street, and the markets became shakier as it became increasingly evident that the sky-high share prices were based on absolutely nothing. The booming economy was caused by the stock market speculation was an illusion. Soon, investors began to bet against the market. Then, on Thursday, October 24th, 1929, after a rush of panicked selling when the market was open, the stock market crashed dramatically. Over 12.9 million shares changed hand in one day. Known as Black Thursday, this crash would cause a wave of unemployment due to sudden drop-off in spending and investment. Many industries collapsed in these early days of panic selling, while those who had taken out loans to buy stocks were left destitute. Many stockbrokers even committed suicide due to the loss of their money. The years 1930 to 1933 would see a wave of banks collapse as investors increasingly lost confidence in the economy. In this period, small banks all across America did not have enough money in reserves to deal with the sudden rush of people who tried to remove all their cash and savings. Thousands of banks were forced to close and many people went bankrupt. And with banks no longer lending, industries quickly ground to a halt. Jobs were cut all across the nation and unemployment reached record high levels. Then, in 1932, the Depression reached its climax, and the Dow Jones hit its record lowest point. The stock market crash in America would have massive consequences all around the world, worsening the already terrible economic conditions. Although a new wave of leaders would step up in the 1930s to tackle the Depression, they struggled heavily to make an impact. In the U.S., Herbert Hoover was inaugurated in 1929, just before the crash, but he had absolutely no idea how to fix it. Eventually, he would be blamed for the rest of his life for the collapse of the American economy. Somewhere between 20 to 30% of the labor force were now unemployed. And although Hoover started a new scheme to provide loans to key industries, it was too little, too late. The global trade situation worsened during Hoover's presidency. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, designed to protect American interests, put a massive trade tariff on imports. This created a further freeze-up of international trade when other countries retaliated. Meanwhile, many ordinary Americans had to stand in bread lines just so they wouldn't starve to death. And many more even lived as hobos, taking to the roads to find work anywhere they could. People were starving in the streets, while farmers could not afford to harvest their own crops, leaving them to rot in their fields. Sprawling shanty towns spread across America, and they were nicknamed Hoovervilles in Hoover's honor. In Germany, the crisis swept the Nazis into power. Hitler was quickly made Chancellor of Germany in 1933, with disastrous consequences for Germany and later for the rest of the world. In the U.S., Franklin D. Roosevelt was sworn in as president in 1933, and he would remain president until he died in 1945, due in part to the incredible series of crises and stress he dealt with. FDR would soon introduce the New Deal, a massive economic relief program designed to save the economy. This multi-pronged, complex wave of legislation was supposed to provide relief, reform, and recovery in equal measure. One central element of the New Deal was creating the Public Works Administration, which aimed to create jobs by developing various building projects. Under Roosevelt's administration, bridges, airports, schools, and other buildings were constructed all across the country. The government went so far as to pay writers and artists to produce their own works of art. Roosevelt would also act fast to save the farmers. Many of them were even now completely ruined. In the South, the plight of agricultural workers was made worse by the Dust Bowl, caused by a wave of drought and high winds. Many of the terrible problems faced by farm laborers across the U.S. are one of the Grapes of Wrath's principal themes, one of the great books to come out of the Depression era. Although FDR would introduce many important legislation measures, many of his measures were controversial. Roosevelt's first New Deal in the early 1930s resulted in a showdown with the Supreme Court, which tried to reverse his policies. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, or AAA for short, aimed to help farmers recover from difficult economic conditions. As well as this, the NIRA, the National Industrial Recovery Act, were both declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. The second phase of the New Deal, from 1935 to 1936, introduced the Wagner Act and the Social Security Act, which have both been long-lasting and have endured the test of time. The Wagner Act gave workers more rights, including the right to unionize. The Social Security Act, on the other hand, gave unemployment insurance to Americans for the first time. And it also provided for the poor, the elderly, and the disabled. Roosevelt won re-election by a landslide on the back of these reforms. But historians are still very divided on whether Roosevelt's measures helped the economy or had no effects whatsoever. Some believe Roosevelt did not go far enough to have a significant impact, but he did prevent people from starving to death. In 1936, the renowned economist John Maynard Keynes would argue that governments must intervene more during a depression to stimulate the economy back. Keynes' economic position was much more extreme versions of Roosevelt's. Roosevelt was still concerned with balancing the books for most of his presidency. Keynes argued that by massively increasing spending, even if it put countries in debt, the economy would be revived by a renewed wave of economic stimulus. These economic ideas are still controversial today, and economists still cannot agree on how much intervention is appropriate or necessary to solve a massive economic disaster. And although unemployment had dropped considerably by 1940, it was still very high, and the Depression remains the longest-running economic downturn in the industrialized world's history. Ultimately, the Second World War helped to end the Depression by creating a vast economic stimulus in the U.S. from 1941 onward. Suddenly, there was no need to create more jobs because everyone was enlisted in the army, or busy making bullets or bombs. To this day, many of Roosevelt's policies remain in place in the U.S., mostly to prevent a repeat of the irresponsibility that led to the wild speculation in the 1920s. The undermining of FDR's Glass-Steagall Act in 1999 is often identified as one of the culprits behind the financial crisis of 2008. Previously forbidden banking activity was suddenly permitted again for the first time since the 1920s. Commercial and investment banks were merged with disastrous consequences for the global economy. While the causes of the Great Depression and the reasons for its end are still contentious topics, Although there have been many economic disasters since then, the Great Depression remains an unparalleled economic catastrophe with no equal in modern times. And thank you for watching.